Hello, my name's Susan Ebbels and I'm a speech and language therapist at Moor House School in Surrey in the UK. This vodcast is related to a paper in child language teaching and therapy which I wrote describing the shape coding system for teaching grammar to children with language impairments. The paper was published in 2007, but this recording is in 2012. So the majority of the vodcast I will tell you about the basics of the system which is described in the paper and some of the evidence, but I'll also give you a brief glimpse updating you on recent developments in the last 5 years. So the shape coding system was developed for children with language impairments, but there's been a lot of interest from clinicians and from teachers as well in using this with other kinds of children, so children with hearing impairment, Down syndrome and autism spectrum disorder as well. But it must be borne in mind that the studies of effectiveness have only been done on children with language impairment, and several of these are discussed in the paper. So the shape coding system is based on the idea that children with language impairments have difficulty implicitly learning the rules of grammar, and they find it easier to learn the rules if you explicitly teach it and use visual support to help them. And that's the idea of the shape coding system. It aims to help teachers and therapists to explicitly teach the rules of grammar using a visual support. And then you should be able to move on to helping correct children's work, either spoken or written. And it enables them to see their mistakes. You can explain why they have made an error using a visual system which they can see. And then they can understand why they've made the errors and how to change them and make them better. And it also means eventually they should be able to start self-correcting either their speech or their own written work. So this paper is going to the paper describes the basics of the system, but also the research evidence. Now the three main features of the system, it has three main features then, which are colours, which underline individual words. So there's different colours for different parts of speech. And then there's a system of shapes which are drawn in black, and they go around phrases in the sentence, and the shape varies according to the role that that phrase plays in the sentence. And then there's also a system of arrows which is useful for showing tense and agreement, for example present versus past tense. I'm going to show you some of these on a couple of slides because it's easier to show this visually. So these are the colours that we use in shape coding. So there are nouns are in red, determiners and possessive pronouns pink, verbs are blue. Now at this point I need to highlight that we've recently changed verbs and prepositions. So in the published paper, in the 2007 paper, prepositions are blue and verbs are yellow, but verbs were not showing up on whiteboards and white pieces of paper with yellow lines, so we have recently changed it. So just to be aware of that. Adjectives are green, prepositions, as I said, yellow, adverbs brown, coordinating conjunctions purple, and subordinating conjunctions are orange. The shapes, as I said before, go around phrases. So the phrases are grouped with shapes and they're linked with a colour, a question and a symbol. So for example, the verb phrase is coded with a hexagon and it answers the question what doing, and it includes a verb or a blue word. An adjective phrase has to include an adjective or a green word, and it answers the questions what like or how feel. A prepositional phrase answers the question where, and it's coded with a semicircle, and it has to have a yellow word or a preposition in it. Subjects and objects have different shapes according to the role they play in the sentence. So they both contain a noun or a red word, and they both answer questions of who or what. But the one doing the action is in the oval and the one receiving the action is in the rectangle, and this is irrespective of whether they're animate or inanimate. So for example, John hits Mary, John would be in the oval and Mary in the rectangle, but John hits the wall would also be the same, where the wall would be in the rectangle. Also the car hits the wall would be the same, the car would be in the oval and the wall in the rectangle. So it all depends on the role they play in the sentence. There are some extra shapes which I use less often for how and when. Then there's the auxiliary shape or modal, which is very useful. So this would be for is, are, was, were, has, had, and also the modals can, could, might, should, would, etc. And then there's a shape for clauses, which I only use if I'm working on conjunctions. And this answers the question what happening. and the children I've worked with called this a cracker. And if you want to have a shape for the question why, then this is a shape you can use. So how does it look in sentences? If you had a whole sentence that's coded with the shapes and the colours, it would look like this. So Ben would tell you who, and what he's doing is putting an apple in the bowl. He's not just putting, if you ask the question, what's Ben doing? The answer is putting an apple in a bowl. So all of that goes inside the hexagon. Similarly, the sad boy tells you who, and what's he doing? Putting his apple in her tasty bowl. And putting his tasty apple in her bowl, rather. And tasty tells you what the apple is like. If you want to, you can put the internal structure in. Now, I only tend to use the bits that I need for what I'm actually teaching today. So if I'm trying to focus on the internal structure of the verb phrase, then I would put these in. And if I'm not, I would leave them out, because it gets very complicated if you put everything in. So if I was working on this, I would put an apple in the rectangle because it answers the question, what was Ben putting in a bowl? An apple or his tasty apple. Where was he putting it? In a bowl or in her bowl? And if you want to get really complicated, you can do the internal structure of that. What was he putting an apple in? A bowl. Was he putting his tasty apple in? Her bowl. And the auxiliaries are all in the diamonds. Then the colours, you've got all the nouns are red, regardless of their position in the sentence. Determiners pink, verbs blue, regardless of whether they're main verbs or auxiliary verbs. And prepositions yellow. Adjectives green. And then if you want to work on tense, you can have an arrow in the middle for present tense and an arrow at the end for past tense. I'll show you a little bit more about the tense in a minute. And you can have a zigzag on the ing. You can also use it to help with subject-verb agreement. So if and only if I'm working on plurals versus singulars, then I use double red lines for plural nouns and pronouns and double blue lines for plural verbs. So you would have the man is happy, where the man is a singular and so is, so it has one line each, but the men are happy. Men is plural, are is plural. Can also help for sentences such as the man and the lady are happy, because in these cases, a lot of children with language impairments will say the man and the lady is happy because it's lady singular, is singular, what's the problem? By using the system, you can show that who is happy in this question is answered by the man and the lady. And inside that oval, there are two red lines, one on man and one on lady. Therefore, you need the plural are with two blue lines. Works for pronouns as well, so you've got he is happy, singular, and they are happy, plural. So for verb tenses, there's a system of arrows, and a vertical arrow is for a finite verb, and if it's in the middle, that's present tense, and at the left, it's past tense. So you'd have he eats, present, he ate, past. For progressive participles, I have a zigzag at the right-hand end under the ing. So you can have he is eating versus he was eating. And this is the is and the was that tells you whether it's present or past tense, not the ing. The ing shows you that the action was going on for a short while. And the basic rule that I teach the children is that every sentence has to have one and only one down arrow. So if you say he eating, as many children with language impairments do, you've got no down arrow, so you need to add a diamond in to carry the down arrow. Either he is eating or he was eating. There's also, for the past participle, we use a horizontal arrow pointing left. I haven't used this very much with the children, only with those who are getting onto a more advanced level. But for this, you would have he has eaten versus he had eaten. So the past participle is showing you that it's past time, and the difference between has eaten and had eaten would be he has eaten is relative to a point now in the present, he's already eaten, but he had eaten means relative to a point in the past, he had already eaten. And for teaching the children, I would tend to use these kind of templates. So this may be in an organiser that they have or on the wall, and they would know that the main patterns which they are likely to be using are the version on the left, top left, which would be something like he is pushing, or they are pushing if you were doing plural, and top right would be he was or they were pushing, and then the bottom would be pushes versus pushed. So how would I teach this system to children who've never come across it before? Well, say I was introducing it to a small group or a class, I might do something like this. I would start off with a simple sentence with a who is and a what doing. And I might get 3 children to come out and come and hold one shape each. And the first child who's got the who would have to tell me a who, somebody who's in the room. Perhaps the teacher, Mrs. Cox. Mrs. Cox is, so the second child would say the is, and the third child would say what she's doing, and she's going to have to do it. So hopefully they say something nice like walking. So then Mrs. Cox will show us Mrs. Cox is walking. And then we'll ask what's happening, Mrs. Cox is walking. And then to make the link between the shapes and the words, we would ask some questions. So who is walking? Mrs. Cox. What's Mrs. Cox doing? What's she doing? Walking. Now, quite early on, perhaps even in the first session, I would try to get them to see that you can have more than one word in a shape. So while Mrs. Cox is walking around the room, I might encourage them. I might say, what's Mrs. Cox doing? They may say walking, but they may say she's walking around the room. So we could add that in because that tells us what she's doing. If you don't get them to start adding more than one word in a shape right from the beginning, they can get stuck at a 3-word level, which we don't necessarily want. To move them on from this, you can teach them about some of the other shapes. So this is one of the basic sentence patterns. Another one would be to replace the what doing with what like. So you could have Mrs. Cox is friendly, or Mrs. Cox is happy. Or you could say where she is. So you can have Mrs. Cox is in the classroom. And these are the basic sentence patterns of English. You can make these more complex by adding things inside. So you can have Mrs. Cox is in the classroom. Mrs. Cox is eating an apple. You can also add on extra bits. So you could have combine these together. Mrs. Cox is eating an apple in the classroom. Or Mrs. Cox is eating an apple. You could add extra ones quickly. Or even put these together. Mrs. Cox is eating an apple in the classroom quickly. We could add a when shape. Maybe yesterday, and if we do yesterday, that's in the past, so we'd have to change is to was. So you'd have yesterday Mrs. Cox was eating an apple in the classroom quickly, which means you've now got quite a long and complex sentence. Obviously you wouldn't do this all in one session, this is spread out over many weeks, but it gives you an idea of the potential of the system. If you got really good at this, you might move on to using what happening. And the what happening shape would go around the whole of this sentence because that tells you what's happening. And then you might add that to another what happening shape if you were doing conjunction. So you might have, yesterday Mrs. Cox was eating an apple in the classroom quickly when the door burst open. But that would be much further down the line and is quite a complex level of language, but you may wish to work on that. Because the aim of the system is to be able to code the majority of the grammar of the English language should you need to work on that with the children that you work with. So what is the evidence for the effectiveness of this approach? Well, in this paper I describe evidence showing that it's helpful for improving the use of past tense morphology in children's written work, and also I describe small studies on improving their comprehension of datives and comparative questions. Since then, I have actually published a few other papers, so there's now evidence in other published papers that it can improve comprehension and production of passives and WH questions, and also production of verb argument structure. And there's some evidence in preparation at the moment, not published, but showing that it can improve comprehension of coordinating conjunctions and production of past tense in spoken language, including in conversation. So, to summarise, the evidence shows that this approach can help school-age children with language impairment to improve their use and understanding of English grammar. And this includes secondary-age children and children with comprehension difficulties for whom there's very little evidence that anything works. So it's nice that we now do have some evidence that therapy can be effective for these groups of children. So these groups of children, secondary age and those with comprehension difficulties, shouldn't be neglected in the provision of services, particularly in these current times of austerity. For further information, you might like to look at a website which will lead you to places which you can get a CD of resources. There's information about courses and also links to publications. And there's also a discussion group that you can join should you wish, which people have joined who are using the system, teachers, speech and language therapists and others, parents as well. And you can email the discussion group with any queries you have, and other people may answer them, or I may too. Thank you for watching, and I hope I've inspired you to try out this approach with some of the children you work with, and to follow it up more by reading some of the published papers, including the one that this podcast accompanies.